The old church sat shrouded in mist, its splintered pews and stained glass whispering of forgotten prayers. Harold, a grieving widower, shuffled through the creaking doors, clutching a faded photograph of his late wife, Margaret. Tonight marked the anniversary of her passing, and the whispers in his dreams promised he'd find her here. As he lit a single candle, shadows danced in the flickering light. A cold wind swept through, and an otherworldly voice murmured his name. Harold sat in his dimly lit living room, the golden glow of a single lamp casting long shadows. The photograph of Margaret lay on the table, its edges frayed from years of touch. He traced her smile with trembling fingers. It had been 5 years since her passing, but the ache in his chest felt as fresh as the day she was gone. 2 weeks ago, the dreams began. At first, they were fleeting glimpses, a laugh here, a whisper there. Then they became vivid. Last night, Margaret spoke clearly. "Come to the church." It was the place where they exchanged vows, now abandoned, crumbling like the memories Harold had worked so hard to bury. But tonight, the pull was irresistible. The anniversary of her passing demanded his attention. The journey was lonely. His cane tapped rhythmically against the pavement as he approached the church, its silhouette looming against the foggy sky. The once pristine spire leaned precariously, its windows shattered. Harold hesitated, his hand resting on the heavy wooden door. Was this real? With a deep breath, he pushed the door open, its creak echoing. Inside, the church was a shell of its former glory. Broken pews and dusty relics scattered across the stone floor told stories of abandonment. Harold approached the altar, placing Margaret's photograph gently upon it before lighting a candle. The flame danced in the damp, stale air. "Margaret," he whispered, voice trembling, "if you're here, give me a sign." A sudden gust extinguished the candle. Harold's breath caught as the air grew heavy, tinged with unnatural energy. Then, faintly, he heard it, a whisper. "Harold." The voice was unmistakably hers. "Margaret?" he called, scanning the darkened hall. The whisper grew louder. Shadows shifted unnaturally. Footsteps echoed from the far end of the church. Harold's heart raced as a figure emerged, its features hidden. It moved unnaturally, as though gliding rather than walking. Harold staggered back. Was this Margaret, or had he awakened something far more sinister? Harold froze as the figure emerged from the shadows, each step echoing in the hollow silence of the church. The extinguished candle offered no light, yet the figure shimmered faintly. "Margaret?" Harold whispered, his voice trembling with hope and fear. The figure stopped a few feet away, its features hidden. Harold's cane trembled as he took a cautious step forward. "If it's you," he said softly, "please, say something." A whisper answered, "Harold." It was her voice, familiar, warm, yet tinged with distortion. Tears pricked Harold's eyes. "Margaret," he breathed, reaching out, but the figure flickered, wavering like a mirage before recoiling. "Wait," Harold called. The figure turned and glided deeper into the church, silent and swift. Desperation overtook him, and he followed, his cane tapping a frantic rhythm. "Don't leave me," he pleaded, his voice echoing off the walls. The figure led him to a side door, warped and covered in scratches. Beyond it lay a narrow corridor lined with faded murals of saints and sinners, their painted eyes following his movements. The air grew colder, and Harold shivered. "Where are you taking me?" he asked, voice faint. The figure remained silent. The corridor twisted before opening into a circular chamber. At its center stood an ancient altar, cracked and covered in dark residue that seemed to pulse faintly. A dim light seeped from the stone, casting eerie patterns. The figure stopped by the altar, its form flickering as though struggling to stay whole. Harold hesitated at the threshold, his heart pounding. "Margaret?" he whispered. The figure turned, and for a fleeting moment he saw her clearly. Her kind eyes, her gentle smile. His breath caught in his throat. But then her face began to change, twisting into something monstrous. The features he cherished became grotesque. Harold staggered back. "No," he murmured, shaking his head. "This isn't real." The figure advanced, its grotesque features flickering. "Why did you come here, Harold?" it asked, the voice no longer hers but a cacophony of whispers. The chamber darkened as the pulsating light grew stronger, shadows closing in. "I came for her," he said, trembling but resolute. "I know she's here." The figure paused, tilting its head. "She's not here, Harold," the voice mocked. "She never was." Rage surged within him, overpowering his fear. "Liar!" he shouted. "I heard her. I saw her." The whispers crescendoed, and blinding light erupted from the altar. Harold was thrown to the ground. When the light faded, the figure was gone. The chamber was silent, save for Harold's ragged breathing. On the altar lay a single object, Margaret's wedding ring, gleaming faintly. Harold reached for the ring, clutching it tightly as tears streamed down his face. "Margaret," he whispered, but as he held it, faint whispers began again, rising from the shadows creeping along the walls, filling him with a chilling sense of unease. Harold's fingers closed tightly around Margaret's wedding ring. Its cold metal bit into his palm as the whispers swirled louder around him, curling like invisible tendrils. The disjointed murmurs carried a malice that made his skin crawl. "Who's there?" Harold demanded, his voice shaking as he turned toward the encroaching shadows. The chamber felt alive, the flickering light from the altar casting distorted shapes on the walls. His cane trembled in his grip as he took an unsteady step back. "Leave me alone," he shouted, but the whispers only grew louder. The air grew impossibly cold, and Harold's breath clouded before him. A low growl reverberated through the chamber, and from the corner of his eye he caught movement. A shadow, darker than the rest, shifting along the edge of the room. It slithered forward, coalescing into a vague humanoid shape. Its face was a blank void, yet Harold felt its gaze pierce through him. "You don't belong here," the shadow hissed, its voice layered with a cacophony of others. Harold raised his cane defensively, though he knew it was futile. "I'm here for her," he said, his voice firm despite the fear constricting his chest. "Where is she?" The shadow tilted its head as if studying him before gliding closer. Harold staggered back, tripping over uneven stones and falling hard. The ring slipped from his grasp, skittering across the floor to rest near the altar. "You're a fool," the shadow hissed, looming over him. "She is gone, and nothing will bring her back." Harold pushed himself up, his gaze locked on the ring. A sudden resolve hardened within him. "No," he said, his voice low but steady. "You're lying." The shadow recoiled slightly, its form wavering as the whispers faltered. "You cannot fight what you do not understand," it spat. "Leave or be lost." Ignoring the warning, Harold crawled toward the ring. The shadow's tendrils lashed out, grazing his arm with icy pain. He cried out but managed to grab the ring, clutching it tightly to his chest. The chamber shuddered, and the shadow dissolved into the dark corners. For a moment there was silence, broken only by Harold's ragged breathing. Then, from the shadows, a familiar voice called softly, "Harold." His head snapped up, his heart pounding. "Margaret?" he whispered. From the far side of the chamber, a faint figure emerged, her form translucent but unmistakable. Her sorrowful eyes met his, and she extended a trembling hand toward him. "Why did you come?" she asked, her voice filled with love and anguish. Harold stood, tears streaking his face. "I couldn't go on without you," he said. Margaret's figure flickered, her expression stricken. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. "It's not safe here." Before Harold could respond, her form began to fade, retreating into the shadows. "No!" he cried, reaching out, but she was gone. The chamber felt colder, emptier than before. Harold sank to his knees, clutching the ring. The whispers returned, softer now, almost mournful. Despite the crushing weight of his grief, a spark of determination flickered within him. He wouldn't leave without answers. The chamber was silent, save for the faint whispers breathing from its walls. Harold knelt, clutching Margaret's ring as if it were a lifeline. The faint warmth pulsing from the metal steadied his trembling hands. He rose slowly, his joints protesting. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice echoing weakly. Her sorrowful image lingered in his mind, her warning clear. Leave. He couldn't. Not yet. The air in the chamber felt heavier now, charged with unseen energy. Harold gripped his cane tightly, his eyes scanning the flickering shadows. He wasn't alone. "Who's there?" he called, his voice firm despite the dread pooling in his chest. From the darkness emerged a figure, faint and wavering, yet undeniably human in shape. Its presence exuded an unsettling authority. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said, its deep voice filling the chamber. "I came for her," Harold replied, his grip tightening on the ring. "I need to know the truth." The figure stepped closer, its features sharpening. Harold could make out the outline of a face, weathered and aged, yet its glowing eyes seemed otherworldly. "The truth?" the figure asked, tilting its head. "You think you'll find it here?" "I saw her." Harold's voice cracked with desperation. "She spoke to me. She warned me." "She is gone," the figure interrupted, its tone sharp but not unkind. "You cling to her memory, even here, where only grief and shadows remain." Anger flared within Harold. "Don't tell me to let go. She was real. She was protecting me from something." The figure's expression didn't change. "There is more at work here than you understand. This place, where the veil between worlds is thin, holds the lost and the damned. But your wife, she is not among them." Harold shook his head, gripping the cane until his knuckles whitened. "You're lying. I saw her." The figure sighed, a sound heavy with centuries of weariness. "What you saw is a fragment, a piece of what she once was. You must leave before this place takes what little remains of her and you." Harold hesitated, doubt flickering. The ring's warmth pulsed, grounding him. "No," he said firmly, "I won't leave, not until I've spoken to her again." The figure's glowing eyes narrowed. "You risk everything by staying," it warned. "But if you are determined, you must go deeper. There you will find what you seek, but the answers may not bring peace." Before Harold could reply, the figure dissolved into the shadows. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him as the chamber shifted. The altar's light pulsed, and a new passageway opened in the wall, its entrance dark and foreboding. Harold stared into the black void, his heart pounding. The ring in his hand grew warmer, as if urging him forward. With a deep breath he stepped toward the passageway, the mournful whispers following. He cast one last glance at the chamber behind him. Then, gripping his cane tightly, he stepped into the darkness. The passageway swallowed Harold in darkness, the air heavy and damp with the faint scent of decay. His cane tapped unevenly against the rough floor as he moved forward, each step echoing into the void. The whispers had faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed on his ears. The faint warmth of Margaret's ring guided him, pulsing gently in his palm. Harold's breath was shallow, his heart pounding as the corridor twisted endlessly. The sensation of being watched gnawed at him, but he pressed on. A dim light flickered ahead, pale and unnatural. Harold hesitated but moved toward it, gripping his cane tightly. The glow revealed a small chamber. At its center stood a pedestal holding a faded book bound in cracked leather. As Harold approached, the air grew colder, the energy around the pedestal prickling his skin. Tentatively, he touched the book. The moment his fingers brushed its surface, the whispers returned, louder and angrier, swirling around him. "You shouldn't have come," a voice hissed. Harold turned to see the shadowy figure, more defined now, its jagged form rippling like smoke. "What is this place?" Harold demanded, his voice trembling. "Why am I here?" "You brought yourself here," the figure replied, its voice a layered chorus. "Your grief opened the way." Harold clutched the ring tighter. "I came for her. I won't leave without her." The figure laughed, hollow and mocking. "She's gone, and you are a fool for believing otherwise." "No," Harold shouted. "I saw her. I heard her voice." "She is a memory," the figure sneered, "and your desperation led you here, where shadows feed on grief." Harold's knees wavered, but he steadied himself. "If that's true," he said, "why does this ring guide me? Why do I still feel her?" The figure recoiled slightly, flickering. "You think it guides you?" it mocked. "It leads you deeper into the dark. The more you seek her, the further you stray." Harold shook his head. "I don't believe you. She's close. I know it." The figure's tone grew harsher. "Then take the book," it said, gesturing to the pedestal. "Open it and see the truth. But once you do, there will be no turning back." Harold turned to the book. The whispers swirled around him, insistent and chaotic. His hand hovered over the leather. "Why would you want me to take it?" he asked, suspicion creeping into his voice. The figure began to fade. "It is your choice," it said, its voice echoing, "but the truth is a burden few can bear." The chamber grew silent again. Harold stared at the book, the ring in his hand pulsing steadily. "Margaret," he whispered, "if you're here, give me a sign." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the faint glow in the room flared, illuminating the walls. Etched into the stone were images of anguish, love, and loss. Harold's breath caught as he saw Margaret's face among them, her eyes sorrowful as she reached for something unseen. Tears blurred his vision as he turned back to the book. With trembling hands, he opened it. At first, the pages were blank, but glowing words appeared. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, and the ground shifted beneath him. The pages turned on their own, faster and faster, until they stopped abruptly. Bold letters glowed. "Do you truly seek the truth?" Harold stared, the weight of the question pressing down on him. "Yes," he whispered, "I need to know." The chamber erupted in light and sound, and Harold felt himself pulled deeper into the dark. The darkness swallowed Harold, the air thick and suffocating. His cane tapped against uneven stone as he moved forward, the faint warmth of Margaret's ring pulsing in his hand. Around him, the silence was oppressive, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen was watching. Ahead, a pale light flickered, revealing a massive doorway carved into stone. The intricate engravings depicted faceless figures reaching toward a towering, shadowy being. Harold hesitated, fear clawing at him. The ring pulsed again, urging him forward. With trembling hands, he pushed open the heavy door, its groan echoing through the void. Beyond the door was a circular chamber, its center dominated by an altar. Floating above it was a glowing sphere, swirling with light and shadow. The whispers returned, louder now, spiraling around Harold like a storm. "Do you truly seek her?" a deep voice boomed, shaking the chamber. Harold froze, scanning for its source, but saw only the sphere. "Yes," Harold replied, his voice trembling but resolute. "I need to see her again." The voice laughed, its tone mocking. "You would risk everything for a shadow, for what is already gone." "She's not gone," Harold said fiercely, clutching the ring. "She's my wife." The sphere pulsed, and from its swirling depths Margaret's face appeared, her expression filled with sorrow. Harold's breath caught as she reached toward him, her translucent hand trembling. "Harold," she said softly, her voice echoing, Why did you come? You shouldn't be here." "I had to," Harold replied, tears streaming down his face. "I couldn't let you go." Her form flickered, her features twisting with anguish. "This place isn't meant for the living. It's a trap." "Then come back with me," Harold pleaded. "We'll leave together." Margaret shook her head, her form growing dimmer. "It's too late for me. But there's still time for you to escape. Please, Harold, go before it takes you too." "No," Harold shouted, reaching for her, but his hand passed through her like mist. The sphere pulsed violently, and Margaret cried out, her form pulled back into its depths. The chamber shuddered, and the whispers became a deafening roar. Shadows writhed along the walls as the golden glow turned blood-red. From the sphere, a monstrous figure began to emerge, its shifting form grotesque and unstable. The voice returned, its tone menacing. "You came for her, but you will stay for me." Harold's heart raced as the creature advanced, its many eyes gleaming with malice. He gripped the ring tightly, its warmth flaring into a brilliant light. The creature recoiled, its form distorting. "What is this?" it roared. Harold didn't know, but he held the ring high. "Margaret," he whispered, "help me." The light from the ring expanded, consuming the chamber. The whispers faltered, and the creature let out a piercing shriek before dissolving into shadows. Harold shielded his eyes as the light engulfed him. Then, silence. When he opened his eyes, he was alone in the darkness, the ring cool in his hand. For the first time, there were no whispers, no shadows, only stillness. "Margaret," Harold said softly. But this time there was no reply. Harold stood in suffocating stillness, the ring cool in his hand. His body ached, but the weight in his chest pressed harder. The silence was deafening, yet he sensed he was not alone. His cane tapped softly as he took a hesitant step forward. The darkness shifted around him, curling like smoke. Ahead, a faint light flickered. Harold moved toward it, his heart pounding. As he approached, the light revealed a chamber. At its center was a chair carved from black stone, and seated upon it was a figure cloaked in shadows. "Harold," the figure said, its voice soft but commanding. "You've come far. Too far." "Who are you?" Harold asked, gripping the ring tighter. "What do you want?" "I am the keeper of this place," the figure replied, "and I am here to warn you. Turn back before it is too late." Harold stepped closer, defiant. "I can't. I came for Margaret." The figure tilted its head, its form shifting. "Do you even know what you ask? She is but a fragment. To bring her back would mean unmaking what remains of her, and of yourself." Harold's voice shook, but his resolve did not waver. "I'll do whatever it takes. I'll give anything." The figure rose, towering over him. Its presence filled the room, pressing against Harold's very soul. "Even your memories, your love for her, that is the price. To bring her back, you must surrender everything you hold dear." Harold froze, the words cutting deep. His memories were all he had left of Margaret. They were his connection to her, his anchor. Yet the thought of a life without her was unbearable. "I'll do it," he said finally, his voice trembling, "if it means seeing her again." "Place the ring on the altar," the figure commanded, pointing to a pedestal that had risen from the floor. The whispers swirled around Harold as he approached. His hands shook as he set the ring down. "Speak her name." "Margaret," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. The ring glowed brightly, filling the chamber with light. The whispers returned, louder than ever, a cacophony of grief and longing. Harold shielded his eyes as the figure dissolved, its voice echoing one final warning. "The path you've chosen cannot be undone." When the light subsided, the chamber was empty, but in the center stood a figure, Margaret, whole and alive, her eyes glistening with tears. "Harold," she said softly, "what have you done?" Tears blurred his vision as he stepped toward her. "I did what I had to. You're here. That's all that matters." Margaret shook her head, her expression stricken. "You don't understand. You've lost everything. For me." Harold opened his mouth to reply, but the words wouldn't come. His mind felt hollow, his memories slipping away like sand through his fingers. He stumbled, clutching at the air as his world began to unravel. The last thing he saw was Margaret reaching for him, her voice a desperate plea. "Hold on, Harold. Please, hold on." The world around Harold dissolved into chaos. The chamber crumbled, shadows swirling as reality fractured. Margaret's voice echoed faintly, distant and unreachable. Harold grasped at the void, but his hands found nothing. When the spinning stopped, he lay on cold stone, gasping for breath. Slowly, he pushed himself upright, the ring in his hand dim and lifeless. The air was dense, heavy with unseen eyes. "Margaret," he called weakly, his voice cracking. A faint figure appeared ahead. Margaret, flickering like a fading flame. Her face was pale, her expression pained. "You shouldn't have done this," she said softly. "I told you it wasn't safe." "I couldn't let you go," Harold said, his voice trembling. "You were all I had." Margaret shook her head, her form flickering violently. "You've given up too much. Without your memories, you're lost. You've tied yourself to this place." "I don't care," Harold said, stepping closer. "You're here now. That's all that matters." But Margaret recoiled, holding up a trembling hand. "This place isn't meant for us, Harold. It's a trap. The longer you stay, the more it will take." "What do I do?" Harold asked, his resolve faltering. "I can't leave you here." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. "You must. If you don't, it will consume you. The ring. Use it. Go before it's too late." "No," Harold whispered, shaking his head. "Not without you." The chamber shuddered and shadows twisted around them. The whispers returned, louder and more chaotic. From the darkness, a voice boomed, "You defy the bargain, Harold. You were given your wish. Now pay the price." Margaret screamed as the shadows surged toward her. Harold lunged, grabbing for her, but his hands passed through her like smoke. "Harold!" she cried. "Let me go!" "No!" Harold shouted. "I won't lose you again." The ring in his hand glowed faintly, pulsing with warmth. Light pushed back the shadows, but Harold fell to his knees, drained. Margaret knelt beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "This isn't where I belong," she said softly, "and it's not where you belong either." Tears streamed down Harold's face. "I've lost everything. Without you, there's nothing left." Margaret leaned closer, her face inches from his. "You still have a choice. The ring. Use it to find your way. But you have to let me go." The shadows pressed closer, the whispers deafening. Harold stared into her eyes, his heart breaking. "Margaret, I love you." "And I love you," she replied, her voice steady. "But love means letting go." With trembling hands, Harold raised the ring. Its light flared, filling the chamber. The shadows recoiled with a deafening roar, and Margaret began to fade. Her lips moved, but her voice was lost in the rising wind. When Harold opened his eyes, he was lying on the floor of the abandoned church. The ring sat cold in his hand, its glow extinguished. The whispers were gone, the air silent. For the first time in years, Harold felt the crushing weight of solitude. Tears streaked his face as he clutched the ring to his chest. "Goodbye, Margaret," he whispered. The church was empty, save for the faint echo of his voice. Harold sat motionless on the cold stone floor, the ring heavy in his palm. The silence around him was oppressive, mirroring the emptiness within. For the first time in years, there were no whispers, no echoes of Margaret, only the quiet hum of his grief. The ring, once warm with the pulse of her spirit, was now cold. He stared at it, his tears blurring its intricate details. What was it all for? He whispered, his voice breaking. I've lost everything. After a long moment, the sound of his cane rolling against the floor drew him back. Trembling, he reached for it and pulled himself upright. The light, filtering through the cracked stained-glass windows, cast fractured rainbows across the broken pews. Harold limped toward the altar, each step feeling heavier than the last. The memories he had surrendered were gone, leaving a gaping void. He remembered loving Margaret, remembered the ache of her absence, but the details, the laughter, the quiet moments, had faded. It was as if someone had smeared a once vivid painting into indistinct shapes. Reaching the altar, Harold placed the ring gently on its surface. The cold stone seemed to drink in its warmth. He closed his eyes, gripping the edges of the altar as if seeking strength from something greater than himself. A voice broke the silence. It wasn't Margaret's, nor the booming tone of the shadow. It was his own, distant and hollow. Why are you still here? Harold's eyes snapped open. The church was empty, yet the voice reverberated. I don't know, he whispered. I thought I'd find peace, but I feel more lost than ever. Peace doesn't come from holding on, the voice replied. It comes from letting go. Harold turned, his heart racing. In the doorway, he thought he saw a figure, a man hunched over a cane, his silhouette painfully familiar. But as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. The weight of those words lingered. Letting go. It was what Margaret had begged him to do, but he hadn't listened. Even now, the thought felt unbearable. She had been his everything, the axis upon which his world turned. Without her, he wasn't sure who he was. The stained glass above the altar caught his eye. Though cracked and dusty, it depicted a figure ascending into the heavens, its burdens left behind. Harold stared at it, his chest tightening. Perhaps Margaret's love hadn't been his weight, but his refusal to release her. With trembling hands, he picked up the ring. The cool metal was a quiet reminder of all he had sacrificed. Margaret, he whispered, his voice raw, I think I understand now. He turned toward the doorway, sunlight streaming through the broken panes illuminating his path. For the first time, the church felt less like a tomb and more like a threshold. Harold took a step forward, his cane tapping lightly against the stone. As he crossed the threshold, the air seemed to lighten. The oppressive weight in his chest eased, replaced by a bittersweet ache. Margaret was gone, but her love would always remain, not as a ghost, but as a memory. Harold stepped into the morning light, the ring still in his hand. The whispers were gone, replaced by a fragile stillness, a quiet that promised, if not peace, then at least a beginning. He took another step, leaving the church and its shadows behind. The morning air felt cool against Harold's face as he stepped out of the church. For a moment, he stood still, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The village beyond the hill lay bathed in soft light, a stark contrast to the shadows he had left behind. Yet the emptiness inside him remained, vast and consuming. Harold glanced at the ring in his hand, its once glowing surface dull and lifeless. It felt heavier than before, as though carrying the burden of all he had lost. Slowly, he slipped it into his pocket and adjusted his grip on the cane. His legs felt weaker now, each step more labored than the last, but he pressed on. The path down from the church was uneven, overgrown with weeds. Harold moved carefully, his cane tapping a steady rhythm. Memories flickered faintly at the edges of his mind, Margaret laughing, her hand brushing against his, but they were fragments, disjointed and fragile. He clung to them, even as they began to slip away. At the base of the hill, Harold reached a small bench overlooking the village. He sank onto it, his breath shallow. The years weighed heavily on him now, but for the first time in ages, the oppressive grief seemed to have lifted, replaced by a quiet, bittersweet ache. A faint breeze stirred, carrying with it the scent of blooming flowers. Harold closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the sun wash over him. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I hope you found peace." The quiet stretched on, broken only by the rustling leaves and the distant chirping of birds. Harold reached into his pocket and pulled out the ring. He turned it over in his hand, tracing its intricate details. Though its glow had faded, it still felt alive in some inexplicable way, a reminder of the bond they had shared. As he sat there, Harold felt a presence, gentle, almost imperceptible, like a hand brushing against his shoulder. He opened his eyes, half expecting to see her standing there, but the bench was empty. Yet the feeling remained, warm and reassuring. For the first time, Harold smiled. The sun climbed higher, its rays illuminating the path back to the village. Harold rose slowly, his body protesting the effort. With the ring tucked safely in his pocket, he began the descent, each step feeling lighter than the last. The memories of Margaret were no longer a weight he carried but a part of him, woven into his very being. As he neared the edge of the village, Harold paused to glance back at the church. Its silhouette stood stark against the sky, no longer a place of shadows but a beacon of something else. Closure, perhaps, or understanding. He nodded once, a quiet farewell before turning back toward the village. Life awaited him there. Not the same life he had known, but something new, something untouched by the darkness he had left behind. Harold didn't know what the future held, but as he stepped forward, the heaviness in his chest eased further. For the first time in years, Harold felt the faint stirrings of hope.